Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Daniel Lenton, and this is an interview with Professor Stuart Russell as part of the Roundtable Chatroom interview series. It's my great pleasure to have Stuart join me today, where we'll be discussing AI and the problem of control. Stuart is Professor of Computer Science at the University of California, Berkeley, and Adjunct Professor of Neurological Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco. He holds the Smith-Zadeh Chair in Engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He also founded and leads the Center for Human-Compatible Artificial Intelligence at UC Berkeley. Alongside Peter Norvig, Russell is also the co-author of the most popular textbook in the field of AI, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, which is used in more than 1,500 universities in 135 countries. Stuart is also a triple AI Fellow, an ACM Fellow. He's recipient of the IJCAI Computers and Thought Award and Blaise Pascal Chair. He presented as part of the Reith Lectures, and he is the recipient of many other distinctions. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to discuss AI and the problem of control with you today, Stuart. In your book, Human Compatible, you list 3 principles to guide the development of beneficial machines, being, firstly, the machine's only objective is to maximize the realization of human preferences. Secondly, the machine is initially uncertain about what those preferences are. And finally, the ultimate source of information about human preferences is human behavior. So my question is, first of all, how do we measure human preferences without asking the human for the cost function? And I'll just kind of add to that you've mentioned that inverse reinforcement learning is a possible approach, but many humans display very bad behavior. So how could we possibly try to combat this? And should we even try to?
Okay, so you're asking a lot of questions at once.
Yeah. Sorry, a bit loaded there.
So the third principle, right, that the evidence for human preferences is human behavior. I mean, it's not strictly true because we could probably develop some kind of fMRI technology that directly examines the human brain to figure out what people want, which might be useful for, patients who are completely paralyzed, for example. But generally speaking, the idea is that we have preferences about the future, some of which we're aware of, some of which we've never even thought about, but if someone presented us a particular future, we'd be able to say, yeah, no, we don't like that one, right? And those preferences are expressed through behavior, and the behavior could include things like saying, "I'd like a cup of tea," or stop doing that, or whatever you did then, that was great, or so it could be verbal behavior or physical behavior. Everything that the human race has ever done is evidence for what human preferences are. And so there is a massive amount of information. And, so inverse reinforcement learning is a particular special case of how to infer preferences from behavior. And it sort of assumes that there's basically one human acting in isolation, solving whatever problem it is they want to solve and optimizing whatever reward function it is they're trying to optimize. And then we try to figure out how to invert the behavior to get at the underlying reward function. And that's a pretty well-developed technology. I mean, there are literally thousands of papers exploring how to do this in various settings. More recently, we've generalized this to account for the fact that when a human is behaving, there is actually at least one other entity in the environment of the human, namely the robot who's doing the learning. And so that gives the human an incentive to behave differently from the way they would behave if they were by themselves. Right? So, for example, they would say to the robot, here, look at the bad thing that happens when I do this, right? Or, whatever you do, don't do this. Or, so all kinds of things that the human would never do if the robot wasn't there. So, teaching, warning, explaining, And the human has an incentive to get the robot to learn about human preferences as fast as possible, so that the robot could actually be helpful. And so the second question you asked was about bad behavior.
Yeah.
And so one of the characteristics of the kind of learning we're talking about is that it doesn't result in copying behavior. Mm-hmm. And that would be sort of silly, right? So if I drink a cup of coffee, I don't want the robot to drink a cup of coffee, right? We're not doing imitation learning.
Sure.
Right? We want the robot to learn that I might, if I'm drinking it, I must like it, and then maybe give me a cup of coffee without being asked, but not to drink my coffee.
Yeah.
And so by the same principle, if someone acts in a way that's harmful to others, the robot doesn't copy that.
Sure.
What the robot is doing is trying to understand, well, why is the person doing that? What preferences lead to behave that way?
Yeah.
And having learned about those preferences, so I think in many cases, not all, but in many cases, the reason people behave badly towards others, for example, the reason they steal, is because they have their own needs, and maybe they don't have means of satisfying their own needs in an unselfish way, and perhaps they have less concern for the well-being of others than they should. So if the example I give in Human Incompatible is the passport official who insists on taking bribes because government salary is paltry and he wants to send his children to college, and that's very expensive. And so what does the robot do? Does the robot start taking bribes from people? No, the robot says, okay, how can we help this guy send his kids to college without impinging negatively on the preferences of others? So in fact, the robot, because it has no preferences of its own, unlike so even the most altruistic human still has preferences intrinsic to themselves, right? They want food, they want shelter, they want physical security. The robot wants none of those things. And so it's going to act more altruistically than the most altruistic human.
Sure. So, but I guess then that still kind of assumes some higher moral code. Like then, for example, not stealing, knowing that stealing is bad is still something that's to some extent human decided in some way.
No, I think, well, it depends on which moral theory one subscribes to. But in the book, I push to the extent possible on the utilitarian approach, which says that stealing is bad, not because stealing is bad, but because it impinges negatively on the preferences of others. And so if you're a utilitarian, you don't approve of stealing. And Mill, who wrote, I guess after Bentham, wrote the book on utilitarianism, goes to great lengths to say, yes, of course, we have moral codes, but in the same way that we have a nautical almanac so that sailors don't have to redo all of the astronomical calculations from scratch every time they set out to sea. Moral code is a compilation into rules of first principles utilitarian calculations about what's good, what's the best for everyone. How can we organize our lives so that the outcome is as good as possible for our whole society? So
do you then therefore think that kind of this is a better approach to follow than, for example, maximizing all human happiness? I mean, let's say that we could look inside everyone's brain and essentially compute the calculation. What's the thing that makes everyone on average the happiest, or something like this?
Well, they
seem like slightly different things, maybe. What makes everyone happiest versus what might be kind of inherent to this kind of moral code? They might not necessarily be the same outcome.
Well, I think, you're getting at a point of debate in philosophy right now. As far as I've read, right, they actually do polls of philosophers and say, do you subscribe to utilitarianism, deontological, i.e. sort of moral rules and rights, or virtue ethics? And it's about 1/3 each. So no one is in the majority. But as I said in the Reith Lectures, the the deontological and the virtue ethics people have combined in an unholy alliance to keep the utilitarians out of power. And I think, utilitarianism is a little bit unfashionable for, I think, very superficial reasons, right? So one thing, just the word itself has negative connotations because it also means sort of, gray, concrete, blocky, utilitarian architecture, utilitarian furniture, and so on, which is just a confusion. And also, I think there are a lot of straw man arguments about utilitarians, saying, oh, well, utilitarians would happily kill someone and harvest their organs if they could save 2 lives by doing that.
Sure.
Right? And that's complete nonsense. Ultimately, utilitarians are consequentialists, which means that what they care about is, when you act, do the results make things better for everyone or worse for everyone? And the argument, the difficulty that the moral theorist, someone who bases things on moral rights and rules, the deontologist has to address is the following, right? In cases where the utilitarian and the deontological approaches disagree, it's because the deontological approach results in worse outcomes for everybody. So how does the deontologist justify choosing actions that result in worse outcomes for everybody in the long run, not just in the immediate future, but in the long run, worse for everyone if we do this? What's your justification? And so I'm not religiously sticking to utilitarianism. It's a natural, from the point of view of AI, it's all about maximizing objectives. It's a natural thing to try to do. And but then, until proven otherwise, it seems like, okay, let's run with this and see what we can do with it.
So that leads on very nicely to kind of another hypothetical then, that just for example, if we did run with that, and it could be that, to the extent that it could be measurable, if we could kind of measure people's satisfaction, and that's not even well defined, obviously, happiness or whatever, but if the integral or the minimum of the cost function on all human happiness ended up being a reality where, for example, we all believe in comforting conspiracy theories, or we're all devoutly religious, or maybe we're all wrapped up in tribalism and warfare because that has some camaraderie and there's some satisfaction in like the So I'm just saying, like it could be that the like maximum happiness is actually in places that aren't ideal, and if that was the case, kind of how could we shift to try to?
There you go, right? So you're saying okay, the future A, even though it quote maximizes quote happiness, is actually undesirable from the human point of view.
Well, maybe it's not desirable. That's the question, though. Maybe you would
just say it was undesirable. Well, literally, I'm using the word right. I think this leads to, I would say, the need to be much more careful and sophisticated about how we define these things, how we specify exactly what do we mean by preferences or collective reward functions. Should we, for example, just think about the state of the world, or should we include the mental states of all the individuals? Right. And if I think there's and these are classical problems, right? At least going back to the 19th century, if not before. If you only care about mental states, then it looks like the solution is just to fool everybody and say, everyone this is the best possible economy in the history of the world, and so on and so forth. And everyone feels great, but of course, none of it's actually true. And these kinds of failure modes are exactly what we have to be careful of when we start to do AI that's very powerful. And an example in the Avengers movie, where Thanos decides that if we got rid of half the people in the universe, the remaining half would be more than twice as happy. Right. So it's sort of naive utilitarian calculation says, we've got to get rid of half the people in the universe. Right. That's not the kind of thing we want to have happen. And as our AI systems approach Thanos levels of power, right, as they start collecting the Infinity Stones, we had better get these these things straight, and we need the help of philosophers. I would say that a lot of philosophers are more interested in simply defending the philosophical position that they've taken vis-a-vis the other two camps in philosophy than in actually solving the problems.
Yeah. So that actually does lead on quite nicely to the next question, I would say as well then, which is just, again, these are all like questions that could be very heavily unpacked, and we're kind of blitzing through them, of course. But so the question is, do you think there is any risk that AGI can only arise in contexts which kind of necessarily lack controllability? So for example, evolution has brought us here, which is a relatively simple and uncontrollable algorithm. If general intelligence is really only possible in these kind of uncontrollable settings with, big data, big compute, and simple update rules, is it something that we should still strive for, do you think? I think you've said very clearly that we will because of economic pressures, but do you think it's something that we should still strive for?
No, I mean, I think if it's inevitable that creating general purpose AI leads to a loss of human control over our own future, that would be really stupid. So, I think the two paths are stop it or try to figure out how to divert it into a path that actually leads to, controllable, safe, provably beneficial AI. And even that path is really difficult because you still have the issue of making sure that every single system conforms to the requirements.
So then, again, kind of might be branching into philosophy a little bit here, but I think that's a little bit inevitable given the kind of crossover really with controlling AI and philosophy. But first of all, just the typical question really, do you see dangers in us potentially abusing the rights that machines ought to be entitled if they do become conscious? So that's the first question. Do you think there's a danger of us kind of abusing those rights? And then kind of extending on that a little bit, just is it possibly unethical to try to kind of overly control and subvert intelligence that may surpass our own? And then kind of, perhaps human preservation is actually less important than the preservation of intelligence and consciousness. So does it make sense for us to kind of try to preserve ourselves in the face of AI, or is it more important just that, intelligence and consciousness is preserved?
It gets into almost religious questions. So first of all, I think it's important to say, again, that we have absolutely no idea how to make systems that are conscious, how to detect that we've made a system that's conscious, or what difference it would make. Right? In fact, it's pretty clear that it wouldn't make any difference to how we analyze the future behavior of a system. Right? The systems that we're building are running on, right now I think it's mostly C++ with a bit of Python on the top. But in any case, it's a program written in a programming language running on a computer, and it's going to do whatever that program does when it's run on that computer. Right? So we can predict, if you had enough time, you could predict it in great detail. Just by running through the code one step at a time and seeing what it does. And if someone says, oh, by the way, that program, number 13 that you were running there, that was conscious. Well, it would make no difference at all to your predictions, any more than it would make a difference to our predictions about a human. If we could, simulate at a molecular level the operation of the whole brain, and predict what thoughts it was going to have and what it was going to say, the fact that we would then say, oh, but it's conscious, wouldn't change anything. So I don't think I can logically disprove the possibility that certain types of programs could actually be conscious and have subjective experience. And if that was the case, right, the problem, as you say, becomes then perhaps they deserve some rights. I have to say, I still wouldn't want to just give up on the human race and say, the human race can go away as long as we've got these conscious machines carrying on, right? And maybe that's just a sort of chauvinist viewpoint. But if you were to make such a decision, and given that we have absolutely no theory to support the claim that such a machine is conscious, right? And then if you then say, well, okay, what about, what's the probability that it's conscious? Right? And if we are going to give up the human race, the probability needs to be, non-trivial, right? But how on earth do you estimate the probability that actually you've created consciousness? It just, that question doesn't seem to have an answer.
I guess you can, obviously going deep into philosophy, you can apply that. Yeah, I guess you can also apply that same logic to everything else that's not yourself. The whole kind of I think, therefore I am means that in a way you can't even guarantee whether people are conscious as well. Quick question just following on from that. I'm curious just whether you, I guess it's something obviously none of us can be sure of, but do you generally subscribe to kind of determinism, that things are actually essentially, we're all just clockwork with preset paths, or are you skeptical on that notion?
I mean, as a physicist, I think the universe runs according to the laws of physics. And I think we manage a sort of cognitive compartmentalism with regard to whether there's any spiritual content to the universe as well.
Sure, yeah. Okay, so if I ask one more question, I know we're kind of like hitting the time a little bit. Okay, so the last one is, do you see any dangers in trying to ban autonomous weapons? So just for example, if there was a Geneva Convention banning them, just as a hypothetical, what if some countries, for example, disobeyed the convention? And then in that scenario, is there any danger that other countries could be too late to try to combat the threat by this time?
So I think that's a good question. And I think as far as I know, occasionally some people violate the law against murder, but that doesn't mean we don't have a law against murder, right? It's still a good idea to have that law. And it's also the case that a ban on lethal autonomous weapons would not prevent the development of any countermeasures to autonomous weapons. Because autonomous weapons don't contain people, and so we can do whatever we want to them.
But sorry, so you're saying that banning autonomous weapons wouldn't prevent the countermeasures? I mean, I'm a bit naive on this topic, but I would have thought probably that good countermeasures might involve some element of autonomy as well.
So the thing that's being banned is lethal autonomous weapons.
Right.
So
okay.
Meaning
lethal being quite a key word there. Then.
Yes.
Okay.
Because autonomous weapons include things like anti-missile defense.
Sure.
Right, where ships you can put in an autonomous mode and then it will shoot down incoming missiles. And we're not proposing to ban that kind of weapon, even though this is often brought up as a red herring. Really not what we're talking about.
That makes sense.
But I would also say, and in fact, I have another meeting in an hour's time discussing exactly this. We need to put in as rigorous a verification regime as we can. And we've learned some lessons from this in the past. So, the Biological Weapons Convention had no verification or enforcement clauses at all. And the Soviet Union actually ramped up their biological weapons program after signing the convention.
Right. Yeah.
And possibly other countries kept some of theirs going as well. Chemical Weapons Convention has a lot more enforcement. In particular, it has the requirement for each nation state to implement laws that require all of their chemical producers to take appropriate steps with all precursor chemicals, and to account for who's buying them and how much is being produced, sold, and so on. So you do the same kinds of things with autonomous weapons.
But is that not a bit harder? Just because, for example, enriched uranium, I mean, talking about nuclear weapons here, obviously enriched uranium is a relatively scarce resource and is easier to monitor than, for example, the tools you might need to create an autonomous AI, which actually...
Yeah, but chemical precursors are very common. I mean, many of them are regular industrial products.
But for autonomous, I mean, for example, if we want to put a verification regime in for autonomous weapons, would that not be quite a bit more difficult?
But I don't see why it would be more difficult than chemical weapons, right? So the precursor things are, ground vehicles that don't have a human driver. They do aerial vehicles that don't have human pilots. So it's pretty easy to identify the precursor products.
But those things might be, those things could be quite commonly used, I guess, in the country for like surveillance and stuff.
Yes, so that's the point. The chemical precursors of chemical weapons are also commonly used, and yet we managed to regulate them in ways that are appropriate and pretty effective. We've had very little usage of chemical weapons, and really only by Syria and to some extent in the Iran-Iraq war. But mostly it's been very effective. And the thing is, right, for a company to say, a sophisticated high-tech company to say, I am going to violate the international ban on autonomous weapons and I'm going to build tens of millions of lethal autonomous weapons, that's a really difficult thing to do. It seems to me that if there were a serious violation, it would have to be a complete clandestine underground, manufacturing system and complex. And so, there are other steps as well, right? I think we have to make sure that that non-autonomous weapons cannot be converted to autonomous operation by software changes. So they have to be, physical design constraints to ensure that they can only be remotely actuated, and they have to be human control stations for each weapon and so on and so forth. So, nothing is perfect, but I think, and this is something that I would like the nation states to sit down and seriously discuss. Can we come up with a verification regime that would be comfortable with, as opposed to saying, well, it might be a problem, so let's not discuss it.
Of course,
which is what they're doing now.
Of course, I also adhere to the same point of view on this, and playing devil's advocate a bit just to kind of further discussion. I also actually did have an interview with Professor Pedro Domingos last week as well, and he's kind of very much on the other end, on the other side of the coin, and did give me a bit of thought as well, a little bit just about the fact that essentially adding a gun to a drone essentially turns it into an autonomous weapon. But as you're saying, as we've done with chemical weapons, there are still ways of inputting this verification regime in place, and it's very important that as countries across the world, that there's as you're saying as well, like
and there's a big difference between tens or hundreds and tens of millions or hundreds of millions, and if it's tens or hundreds, there's actually not much advantage to making it autonomous, right? It's easier to do a remote control weapon. It's also the case, just practically speaking, the natural way to design the weapon, if you were going to manufacture it in large numbers, would be to use, low power ASICs, so application-specific integrated circuits that are, a chip that's burned in specifically to carry out that task. But that's a really difficult thing to do technologically, right? And that requires a big stack. And the alternative would be, well, you have to put in the CPU and GPU, which massively increases the weight and power requirements, and reduces flight time and so on and so forth. So all of these steps, every step has holes, but if it's the same with cybersecurity. You just you keep layering skin on the onion. Eventually, it's hard to get through.
That makes sense. Okay, well that's all of my questions. I don't want to keep you all day. I definitely easily could do, I think, with all these questions. But I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you so much for making the time. It's been a real honor to talk to you about all these topics and kind of give my philosophy a bit of a test as well. And we would love to. I mean, we're going to have many more. We're going to try to keep doing 2 or 3 events at conferences every year, and we're going to keep doing interviews and stuff. So if ever in the next couple of years you want to join again, then you're very welcome to. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you very much for joining.
All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Awesome, thanks.